Alright guys, there's the tail all done. Links are sized, everything moves nice and free. Belt is on. I have not set tension yet. You can see the tail box still rotates. I'm going to do the tail tension absolutely last. Everything's ready to go. Set the tail tension as well as make sure the tail box is square. The only other thing I have done off camera was I did go ahead and glue, or rather epoxy on the control rod ends. These need a good solid hour to cure in my mind. I like to make sure, they call it 30-minute epoxy. I always give it a lot longer than that before I mess with it. So by gluing this now, by the time I'm done building the head and the swash, which is next, this will be ready to go on the helicopter. That said, let's clear my workbench here real quick. What's next is the swash plate. Now this is an all-new swash for the 516. The geometry is optimized for the size of the helicopter. It is a serviceable design, modeled after the 766 swash, but it is a unique swash for this helicopter. The swash balls are smaller. The overall mass of the swash plate in general is smaller. You're going to want to make sure you tear this guy down. Like I said, it is used as serviceable. You have 4 2mm bolts holding an upper and lower inner swash ring on there. The 10mm Heim ball is right there, as well as a large bearing for the swash plate ring itself. You're going to want to make sure you pull all these bolts and Loctite them all. I'm a big fan of using red Loctite anywhere that a failure could cause me to crash. So I will use red Loctite on the swash balls. Note, this is very important. On these 2mm inner swash ring bolts, do not use red Loctite on those. You will be causing yourself lots of headache. These 2mm bolts are meant to just be snug and let the Loctite do its job. If you use red Loctite, breaking them loose could actually break the bolt, and then you're in a world of hurt. Also, these 2mm bolts are a design fail point. In the event of a hard crash, if the blades hit the ground hard enough to damage a blade, check these 4 bolts, and in my opinion, replace these 4 bolts. Again, these separating in flight are going to cause you a world of hurt. When you're putting these back together, it is very important. You notice I'm using 2 fingers here. You just want to snug those down, again with Loctite. I'll do that off camera. Snug as you can get them with 2 fingers. That's all the torque those bolts need. Let the Loctite do its job. There are 4 bolts on the bottom of the swash plate, and they're simply there to keep the swash bearing from walking. You will want to pull those and blue Loctite those. So I'm going to use blue Loctite on the 8 black bolts, as well as red Loctite on the 8 pivot and anti-rotation pin balls. I'm going to go ahead and cut the camera, break this swash down, and start Loctiting it. Alright guys, there we go. Swash plate is complete. Red Loctite on all the balls, blue Loctite on the 8 black 2mm retainer bolts, and I went ahead and used blue Loctite per the manual on the anti-rotation pin. That makes sense. A hard enough crash that could bend, you'd want that to come apart fairly easy. Again, finger tight on these 4 2mm bolts holding the inner and upper and lower swash rings together. Nice and smooth, no play. Heim ball glides well on the bushings. That swash is ready to go. Now, the manual has us working on swash to servo links and mounting the servos next. I am actually going to do this video without mounting in electronics. I don't want to bias anyone towards my electronics choices. There are a lot of good choices for electronics in this bird. So I'm skipping over the servo step and going on to completing the main frame, which takes us to the anti-rotation pin. Now, on this helicopter, which is kind of a first for Synergy, the anti-rotation pin is still carbon fiber, but it goes down inside this aluminum plate. Now, something you want to pay attention to on this plate. There are the 3 bolts that go through the plate and capture the carbon fiber rotation guide. Only one side of that plate are threaded. Purpose for that is when you put the bolts through the carbon fiber, you can snug it up and clamp that rotation guide. If you put the bolts in backwards, it will capture the anti-rotation pin. The screws are long enough, but because you're threading into the side that's threaded, there's no clamping action, and your anti-rotation guide could be loose. So just pay special attention. Make sure you are inserting the bolts from the side that is not threaded, and using the thin walls of this aluminum mount to clamp the rotation guide. Once built, that rotation guide goes on the top of the helicopter, right here to these two 2mm bolts, right on 2.5mm bolts rather, that are on the top of the upper bearing plate. And that's just what we're going to do now. When I come back, I'll have that guide on there for you. Alright guys, anti-rotation guide is on. I went ahead and put the swash on. You see how that work goes in there, nice and tight. Blue Loctite on these two bolts, blue Loctite on the 3 bolts holding the rotation guide to the mount. And that part is done. We are ready. I'm going to double check the manual real quick, but I'm pretty sure the next step, actually the next step is to go ahead and finish building the tail control rod and 90 the tail box. I will go ahead and cut the camera and get the control rod out, and we'll start talking about that. Alright guys, here we are talking about the tail control guide. I have gone ahead and pre-threaded one of the tail control links on. You can't put them both on until the shaft is in the helicopter, because otherwise it won't pass through the tail rod guide that's clamped to the boom. These actually, you can't fine-tune the position of these links until you've got the tail servo on there and you're doing your flybarless setup. You're going to adjust the length here to center the servo with the bell crank centered. Those are all things you'll do during your flybarless setup, but for now I just run them down a little over halfway of the travel, and then I will take the helicopter, slide this rod through the guide. As you can see, it's a little snug. I may have gotten a little epoxy on it. That'll get slid. I'll have to file that a little bit. I got a little epoxy on there. That'll slide through there, and you put the other link on, and then the tail control guide will be done. Once the tail control rod guide is done, the manual calls to set the tension on the belt. Let me get the control rod on, and I will talk to you about tensioning the belt. Alright guys, I have the tail control guide in there. It is, went ahead and clamped and clicked it onto the bell crank just so it wouldn't flop around. Obviously I haven't fine-tuned the clamp or even added the tail servo yet, so it's not connected up here. But at least now, between being connected at the bell crank and running through the guide, it can't fall anywhere. The next step is actually tensioning the belt, and this is going to be a little hard to do on camera, but I'm going to certainly give it a try because it's very important. Bear with me one second. You can see the tensioner right here. You notice as I pull on the belt, it moves. You need to adjust the tension on the belt to where this arm is 90 degrees to the frame. So as you can see, as I'm sitting right now, my belt is actually too tight. So I need to adjust the tail, adjust the clamps, make sure I'm flush up here. Looks like I am actually a little bit recessed there. But I need to get a little bit of slack on the belt so that my arm looks more like that. Okay, not much, minute, but it's important that that be centered on neutral, because the tension's going to vary as it runs. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust things, get my belt tension accurate, clamp the belt down, clamp the tail box down with the box 90 degrees to the main shaft so it's all square, and then we will tear into the main head. Alright guys, the bulk of the mainframe is done. The belt is on, the tail box is tensioned and locked at 90 degrees to the main shaft. We are ready to move on to the main rotor hub. Now, while there's nothing really groundbreakingly new in this head, everything's just smaller. A couple of key things to note. Matt did retain the 10mm main shaft standard that he likes on his bird smaller than the 766. He also left an 8mm spindle on this, which is just absolutely massive for a bird of this size. The spindle is going to be extremely strong. As you can see, he has custom machined the head to shave some metal for weight where he could, while leaving it beefy in the places where it needs to be strong. These are unique parts. Different bearings, different thrusts, different main grips, different follower arms, different spindle, different main shafts. So the parts are all unique to this helicopter, but the assembly is pretty much the same. You've got an inner and outer radial bearing on each side. You have a shim between the inner radial bearings and the dampers, as well as a thrust bearing on each side. The spindle bolts take a 5mm wrench. We're going to talk about that in detail here in a second. The swash followers are reused from the the swash follower adapter is reused from the 766, but it does use the smaller link. So you're going to be paying attention when you're putting this together that you don't try to, when you're buying replacement parts rather, you do want to make sure you grab the right size links. These are not the standard 5.5mm balls that Matt uses on his bigger birds. One other thing to note on this assembly is that Matt did carry on the grease ports, but also the 0 pitch marks in the head, which are becoming extremely popular in helicopters these days. Matt did it on the 766, and they are included on the 516. Zoom in so you can see those. You can see how there's that little hash mark right there. I have tested these extensively. They're extremely accurate. You can use these to find your 0 pitch real easy. I always check it with the pitch gauge to be sure, but I have found them to be incredibly accurate. I'm going to go ahead and cut the camera and break the head down, and I'll be right back. Alright, one more note on taking the head apart. This comes up all the time. It's even come up recently on the team forums with newer team members building Synergy's alpha kits for help us beta test. The question I get a lot is, why are the spindle bolts from the factory so darn tight? Now listen, I assure you there is 0 Loctite on these parts and there is 0 grease on these bearings. You, as any experienced builder will know, you cannot just throw this head on your helicopter and go fly it. But you would be surprised how many people do just that. They say, oop, the bolts are tight, head looks good, pre-assembled in the factory, we're going to go fly it. Can't do that, guys. Now, what happens is a guy puts this on his helicopter, flies it, and it comes apart. Now you got a customer mad. Oh, it says pre-assembled by the factory for parts verification in the manual. That doesn't, if it's just a liability. So what Matt does is he has the spindle bolts tight on purpose. That way it lessens the chance that some newer builder is going to put this on their helicopter without properly building it and have it come apart in their face. Now, I hear a lot of people complain, well man, you just can't get these bolts loose. Well, let me tell you what, if you are trying to use a 4mm driver like this, that's where you're making your mistake. 4mm angle hex on Allen on one side, standard Allen key on one side, and then I use this Allen index on the other side, which is nice. I can give it a 90 degree, give myself a nice handle. Now, I have taken apart lots and lots of Synergy heads, and using these two tools, it never takes more than that to pop them. You hear that click? It was certainly tight. There's no doubt about it. But with the correct tools giving you the right mechanical advantage, it's not hard. Now, the question gets asked, well, you got one side off, how do you get the other side loose? It's where your grippy comes in. If you don't have a a feathering shaft tool yet, get one. This happens to be Bobby Watts' Redneck Grippy. I got lucky. He found a bunch of these in his garage when he moved a couple years ago and posted them up, and I snagged one. This thing is fantastic. It's got an 8mm and 10mm feathering shaft wrench, as well as down here you have a clamp that can be used for 6mm feathering shafts. This is a really nice tool. They're one-way bearings. You put them on there. One direction lets it. You can use it to loosen. Oop, backwards, like so. Now my other spindle bolt is loose. Or when I'm putting it together, I can flip it around, and now I can use it to get the bolts tight. Invest in a feathering shaft tool if you don't already have one. Line makes one. You can still find replicas of the grippies around. Hell, send Bobby Watts a message. Maybe he's found some more. It's Great tool, imperative you have one of those in your toolbox. But as you can see, with the correct tools, that head came apart no problem. No fighting, no people telling me had people telling me that they've about made their hands bleed from trying to get these heads apart. It's because they're trying to use 4mm drivers instead of the proper Allen key. I'm going to go ahead and save you the time of watching me build this head. If you've seen any other build video by any manufacturer, the components of this head are the same. Do make sure you push these dampers out and thoroughly grease them. I will tell you that on the 516, these are tight on purpose. We have made the bore in the head smaller by just a fraction of a millimeter so that it pre-compresses the dampers more. That does a couple of things for us. It gives us an extremely crisp cyclic feel, but it also increases the longevity of the dampers. No longer are we going to be having guys adding scotch tape to their dampers to make them last longer. This is a nice revision, but it does make them, when they're dry like they are now, they are difficult to get out, so be careful. Don't tear them up. I'm going to go ahead and then break this thing down, lubricate everything, put it back together, and I'll come back and show you the finished head. Alright guys, there she is. Head is all done. A couple things to point out. And I should have done it before I built it, but I forgot. I'm going to talk about it now. If you are new to a Synergy helicopter, as I'm expecting the 516 will bring some new pilots to us, the pitch arms are held on with 3mm bolts that actually go through the pitch arm into the grip. These bolts have two different lengths. The shorter one must go in the front, otherwise you could actually impact the outer radial bearing. And then the longer one goes on the rear where there's just more meat in the grip. Note, I use red Loctite here. You cannot super tighten torque these, or you could risk stripping the aluminum. So snug them down good and tight, but use red Loctite. Just the insurance, keep those from coming out. I'm a huge fan of using red Loctite on any bolt. That failure will cause a crash for sure. And if the pitch arm comes off, you're having a nasty crash. I also use red Loctite on the swash balls, on the pitch link balls rather, on the ends of the arms. That is very, very important. And then on the other side, did the same thing. You got the two bolts, shorter on the outside, long on the inside, red Loctite. Lots of grease in here. Greased the pivot ball, pulled the dampers out, greased them. They go back in a lot easier than they came out with grease on them. So that's very, very helpful. They do go back together. Another note to keep in mind, if you are new to Synergy, the threaded rod that this swash follower arm link bolts to is also a set screw that captures the screw in this link adapter. Make sure you pull that shaft out, Loctite it, put it back in. That will keep this bolt captured on this link adapter so that this bolt can't back out. And there's one of those on both sides. When you're taking this apart, pay special attention to where the shims are. These are the 766 style link adapters, so there is no shim there. There is a boss on the adapter that contacts the inner bearing, but there is a shim on the outside of this bolt and a shim on the outside of this bolt, as well as a shim between the swash follower arm and the head, so that you can tighten up this bolt and this arm will still move freely. That's pretty much it on the main rotor head. I'm going to go ahead and loosely fit this on the model, and then we're going to do a little bit of a recap of the airframe, and I think that'll about wrap up this particular build series. Alright, as I said in the other videos, I have not put electronics in the helicopter in this model. I don't want to bias anyone's opinion, but in typical Matt Bodos fashion, he has listened to his customers, and we are now including turnbuckles for both the swash to servo and swash to pitch arm links. These guys have a nice line on one side to indicate which side is the left-handed thread. Good old school trick, put a little chapstick on the threads. That will help lubricate them just enough to make them adjust without popping off the links, but not so loose that they can make them move in flight. It's a good tip. My battery tray was actually already built because as soon as I got this extra kit, I used the second tray from my Alpha models. Nice having two trays. This uses the same locking assembly as the 766. Same thing applies. Make sure you remove and Loctite this pin that acts as the lever. That is just screwed in, and as I learned on my 766, if you don't Loctite that pin, you will lose it in flight. The trays are omnidirectional. You can put the lock pin on either side, doesn't matter. One note, because these screws are so close together, it does allow the lock to possibly tighten up slightly off square. Just ensure that it tightens up square, that way the pin pops through the hole in the main shaft and the main frame nice and easy. The production trays have both laterally mounted slots slots in the sides for laterally strapping the packs, as well as a slot on the end for a lengthways mounting the pack. My Alpha build required the lengthways. It works great. The side to side is just something we feel the customers might want. It does lend itself to more standard size battery straps that way. Piece of cake. There is a ton of clearance between the tray and the ESC tray, so having the buckles on these up top is not a problem. It actually works out really, really well. We'll look for a video from me tomorrow where I talk, possibly the day after, where I will use my Alpha build as an example of recommended electronics. I'll talk about recommended batteries and packs that I've tested, as well as give you a detailed view of how I ran the wires. That pretty much wraps up this build video, with one exception, the canopy. Now, Matt has actually worked very hard with the factory to adjust their molds so that you should no longer need to size the grommet holes. It's actually not too bad like they are. Don't be afraid to size them if you need to, but be careful. Don't oversize them. Remember, the front posts are friction fit. If you oversize the hole, you could have a loose fit on the front. Your canopy might move around. As well as having the rears be a little snug helps hold these keychains in place. That's pretty much it, guys. I'm not going to go into any setup detail in this video. You're more than welcome to see any of my other videos on setup on Icon, and there are lots of videos out there for CGY and V-Bar. I'm going to go ahead and tidy this up, and as I'm post-processing this, and watching it back, if I see I missed anything, I might make some revisions and some comments, but for the most part, this helicopter is all set. Thanks for following along.